Well, Nim, again, it was so great to meet at Exponential and to hear some of your story. And I, already kind of know there's multiple nationalities and stories. So maybe you could just start by kind of sharing a little bit of your story as a Samoan, as in Australia and Canada. Just kind of give us a little rundown.
Yeah, sure. I was born in New Zealand
Okay.
uh, to Samoan parents,
Hmm.
and I left New Zealand when I was 4 and went to Australia, in Sydney, Australia. That's where I grew up. That's where I did my schooling. That's where I've done my tertiary education. And so, born in New Zealand, two Samoan parents, been growing up in Australia. And then I married an Australian, a white Australian. And so my kids, are half, white and half Samoan.
Uh-huh.
And so they've got beautiful brown skin.
Amen. Great.
Yeah,
Uh,
so I've got 5 kids and 4 grandkids.
oh,
And so, they keep us busy. And
uh,
the two older boys are married.
hmm.
And so they got 2 kids each, a boy and a girl each. And then we had 4 boys and 1 girl. So it was
Uh,
a busy household.
yes. That's amazing. Just to go back, how long were your, you know, uh, generationally, how long were your parents in New Zealand? How did they?
Yeah, so my parents were the first of their generation to go to New Zealand. My
Hmm.
grandfather started a church in his village in Samoa, and
Mm.
so felt the call to migrate to another country because a lot of Samoans were moving to Australia and New Zealand
Oh,
to be part of church planting,
really?
to plant Samoan churches. And so
Uh-huh.
my parents joined one in New Zealand. And then there was a group that wanted to come over to Australia in Sydney to plant a church. So they joined that one, and that's grown since then. And so I didn't know too much about the planting, because I
Hmm.
was a young kid.
Yeah.
But that's what sent a lot of the Samoans out of in my family was because of church planting.
Mm. Cool. So it's a little bit in your blood then, huh?
Yeah, it is. It is. To see it, and
Uh-huh.
especially from the ground up, where it's really family oriented.
Yeah.
And so just to see that was good, but it's got its downside too because culturally you're in a different culture,
Mm-hmm.
in New Zealand or Australia, and then you've got the Samoan culture that's very strong, and then your schooling system is very Australian, and
Mm.
so there was a lot of identity issues there. Am I Samoan first? Am I Australian?
Yeah.
Am I Christian first? Like
Hmm.
it took a lot trying to figure that out.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd love for you to share more about that. Even kind of in our church, we talk like once a month now, we're doing these sort of spiritual and cultural testimonies where people, talk about coming to faith, but then how their culture informed that. So how would you, as you talked about those multiple kind of identities, how
Mhm.
would you kind of describe what that process was of coming to faith and coming to understand who you are?
Yeah, so the schooling system is Australian, and so in that culture, you have a voice, right? You can share how you're feeling. You can share why you're upset, and if there's a disagreement, they want you to talk it through, and listen, to each other. In my culture, you don't have that. It's in my culture, it's okay. You did wrong. You disciplined. You're the younger one. You don't need to know why. You just obey.
Mm.
So it was two different cultures, and it was clashing because at home I would be led and disciplined in the Samoan culture. Then I go to school where I spend most of my time every day. I was disciplined and led in a different culture, and so it was kind of confusing. At the time, I didn't realize that tension was causing a turmoil in me and an identity crisis. It wasn't until I was maturing around my 30s
Mm.
that I was starting to look back and try to understand my makeup. And I realized that tension really caused a lot of turmoil in my life, for me to be able to understand, okay, I am Samoan, living in Australia, proud Samoan, but I got to take what's good from my culture that can work in this culture, and that way I can thrive, as opposed to trying trying to hold the two in balance, hold the two in tension is what I found worked best for me.
Mm. Mm.
So coming to Christ was good because the Samoan culture paints a really beautiful picture of the church in Acts, the way they do community, the breaking of bread daily, the way that you honor, the elders, you take care of everybody. And so being in the Samoan culture was a beautiful picture of community. Um, but not to speak for everyone else's walk, but for my walk. But then it painted a different picture of God, because it was so discipline heavy. So it painted a picture of God as a disciplinary, a God that's always looking down to catch me doing what was wrong. Because in my church, if the young people did something wrong, we they called it censored. You were censored for 3 months or 6 months. You weren't allowed to come to church,
Wow.
And so that was the kind of church I grew up. Even though God, it was a loving community, but their practice of discipline was so harsh,
Mm.
that it gave me a negative picture of God.
Mm.
And it would take me meeting my wife, who at the time was my girlfriend, and going to her church, which was a white church. And it was that church that gave me the picture of God in grace and love. Um, and then I struggled with that as well. How could that God love me? And but then I realized that the way my wife loved me and was gracious towards me, I realized that everything that God is, I'm living with it,
Mm.
and that's what convinced me. And then I gave my life, back in '99, and my wife and I got baptized at the same time.
Mm.
And we've been together. We met in high school, so this year will be our 30 years together. So it's been a long time with her, but yeah, it was really through her witness, just in being herself, was what really got me to see that God is a God of love and a God of grace, God of mercy. At the same time, a God of justice.
Mm.
So that's how I came to faith.
Mm. Mm. Um, you mentioned like it wasn't really till your 30s that you began to look back and try to make sense of these different identities. What kind of catalyzed that and, helped you in that journey of understanding or reconciling kind of being bi or tricultural? Um,
Yeah, it was my mom. There was one I was had anger issues and I was trying to deal with them and I couldn't, no matter what I was trying, I just couldn't get over my
mm,
anger issues, always wanting to fight, always wanting to that was my first response if you offended me.
uh-huh.
And it wasn't until just sitting with my thoughts one day, I realized that the way my mom disciplined me really affected me. So in my household, my mom was the disciplinary.
Mm.
And so we would always joke that she was the Old Testament God and my dad was the New Testament Jesus. Because my dad was like this loving, patient, humble guy.
Mm.
And when my dad was getting ready to discipline you, we would cry because we knew we broke his heart, before he would even discipline us. That's how much, love and grace and humility this man had. But my mom, her first response was to beat us, and I won't go into those details, but they were quite extensive.
Mm.
And so I realized that had caused a lot of trauma for me. And so I knew I had to deal with that. And in dealing with that was when I could see the confusion between the different cultures that I was growing up in. And what made me, um, why it was critical to me was because now at that time when I realized I was looking at two young men that I just brought into the world who were biracial. And if I couldn't figure this out, then I'm not going to be able to parent them in a way to live in this biracial state, to love their Samoan culture, to love their white culture, and to be able to thrive in Australia, so that they wouldn't have to go through, the that transition that I needed to go through to understand. And so for us, we've brought them up to appreciate both sides of the culture, to recognize that they are Samoan and they are white Australian and to appreciate it. So that's how I got onto that journey.
Mm. Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's interesting how, to kind of fast forward that as I recall, your mom kind of came to Vancouver with you right? Kind of as an expression of I don't know, hospitality in a way, or I don't know how you describe it, but that's interesting because how did your relationship with your mom kind of grow and how did it heal even from those prior experiences? And then I'm just kind of curious about that part too.
Yeah. So once I knew that my mom had a part to play, so I went home and just asked her that I had something to talk to her. I hadn't seen any therapist or any. I was just me and my thoughts,
Mm,
and I knew that I needed to go talk to because my mom was still my friend. Like
mm,
we're still best of friends.
mm,
So we went home. I told her it was something sensitive, and so it's just me and her in her room, and I was crying through my words and telling her, the
mm,
way that she disciplined me, really hurt me in a way that it did some damage there.
mm,
And so for her, her first response was, um, I'm so grateful you came because I always wanted to talk to you about this, but I just didn't have the words,
mm,
And so, I forgave her. We both, reconciled that
mm,
day, and we were able to find a way to move forward.
mm,
And since that day, we've been able to not look back at that and allow it to harm us. And I've come to the appreciation. She was an immigrant working, she gets up at 6 a.m., finishes at 2:30 p.m., starts her second job at 3 p.m., comes home at 11 p.m.
wow.
just to put us through private school,
Mm,
and so I came to understand that she was under immense pressure. And even though she redirected her anger to me, and it's not excusable, but I can appreciate the pressure she was under because
mhm,
we got to talking and we were reconciling. And so that's how we came to be able to forgive each other.
mm. Wow, that's powerful. Um, let's see, anything kind of like before your transition to, do you call it CIV or do you
Yeah,
call it,
CRE
yeah,
or Church in the Valley. Yeah.
Church in the Valley? Yeah. Um, any kind of, I don't know, key formational things that kind of prior to you coming that, you know, that would help to understand your journey, spiritually and culturally and ministry wise?
Well, for me was um, God had prepared me because there's no church like Church in the Valley in Australia.
Mm.
A big building. It's a big church. There's nothing like that in my denomination in Australia. Nothing, anything close to that. But I was the lead pastor at our university church, which was a
Mm.
big church, and so having multicultural there because you got students coming from all over Australia and New Zealand
Huh?
and some parts of the world, and I was the
Oh,
lead pastor there, and so
okay.
you've got all these melting pot of cultures, and it was a beautiful thing to have,
Mm. Hmm.
and so to be able to have that experience before going to CIV in Canada was really helpful. But also growing up in Sydney, Australia is a multicultural city.
Mm.
Like where I lived, you had so many different ethnicities, from Lebanese to Egyptian to white, to Chinese to Philippine. Like it
Mm.
was it was the best, the best of foods. And because all of us had community cultures, we would always play basketball together, rugby together,
Uh-huh.
and then we'll have a cookout, at the end. You
Yeah.
can look out and you see all our parents together cooking out,
Uh-huh.
while we're playing sports, and then we would eat together. So I was used to the multiculturalness of Sydney, Australia,
Hmm.
and so a large part of my upbringing prepared me for a multicultural church because of the environment I grew up in.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's beautiful. Um, and then tell us, tell us about this process of coming to CIV and the way it diversified and grew and people, embraced their own cultural identity in the shirt. So kind of tell us that story again.
Yeah, so it really starts with my mom.
Mhm.
So my culture, when you take a big move like this to another country, my culture will send one person with the family. Their sole job. is to come over and make sure we can settle in, and all the family gives that one person money,
Mm.
so that they can pay for groceries, set you up. And that's what my mom was doing, and then she would go home after 3 to 6 months, and she would report to the family any needs that she could see, so that the family back home will put their resources together and send whatever the need is, right? And so my mom came over to Canada with me. She's looking around at the church. We're going around in the local community areas, and we meet not one Samoan,
Uh-huh.
not one. And we were that interested in finding a Samoan that if they look Samoan, we would literally go out of our way to go, hey, bro, hey, what nationality are you?
Uh-huh.
You
Uh-huh.
know, they
Uh-huh.
would either be Mexican or Filipino,
Uh-huh.
but not Samoan. And so my mom was really interested in us trying to find it. So we're looking around and we
Mhm.
couldn't find, we never met one Samoan. And
Wow.
there's not one Samoan in the church.
Mm.
And so for my mom, she saw that, was like, son, you need to make sure you wear your Samoan shirts, like this one I've got on. And my leis, I got different kind of leis, brown, red.
Uh-huh.
And so my family sends me shirts and these different leis. We call it ulafala. And so she said, make sure you're preaching these, so that the church can visibly see you are Samoan, because I don't want you to forget who you are and where you've come from, because there's not a Samoan here. And to be here without a Samoan, and it's hard to make sense to people, but I feel like my legs have been cut off
Mm.
because I'm so disconnected to my people, to my community. Even though I can build community, it's
Mhm.
not the same, as being around my Samoan community. And so we have to travel across to Seattle, which is a 2.5 hour drive. We've got some friends there that are
Uh-huh.
Samoan, so that we can hang out, eat Samoan food,
Yeah.
and then come back to Canada. And so that was my mom. And so just me preaching in these shirts and wearing my ulafalas, it just all of a sudden we started seeing people coming in with their cultural gowns. They're wearing their Filipino shirts and they're wearing their African gowns and their African hats, representing where they come from.
Mhm.
And I was at a multi-ethnic workshop. I think his name was Mark Dimas, I think.
Moss. Mhm.
And he shared about having a slide with um, different languages. And so
Mhm.
I brought that back. And just to have that one slide, with different languages, I didn't know how much power that was going to have for people to see the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 1 to 11 in their own language, how much power that would have. But for them to wait for me at the end of the service to say, thank you for speaking in my language. I didn't speak in their language, and I didn't know what they were referring to,
Uh-huh.
because we only translate the sermon in Spanish and Russian, because there are two biggest people group that are in our church.
Mm.
But what they meant was the sermon slide. That
Oh.
one slide was what they were referring to, speaking in their language, and they felt seen.
Mhm.
And so in September this year, 2025, it will officially be 3 years that I've been at CIV. And the church, these are not official numbers because we never measured it, but it felt like the church was 70% or 65% white, and then 30 or 35% others. Today, when you look around at the church, it's like 55% white and 45%, others. Like it's the cultural landscape has changed so quickly. We have, a big group of Russian-speaking people in our church, and which is beautiful to see because they're both Russians and Ukrainians. And the way our leaders have everyone focused on mission,
Mm.
that's why they don't fight.
Mm.
They had their own Russian speaking Easter service after our main service, and they invited me to speak at that one. So I spoke at it. It was such a beautiful event. And we have a big Spanish group as well, and the Brazilian group is growing, Filipino is big, and so everyone's starting to come and be seen in their own culture, and they're not afraid to be seen.
Mhm.
And I think that's largely why people are coming to the church, because they come to visit and they go, oh, he's Filipino, because it's very easy to identify them in their gown. And so I think when I talk to people of why this happens, I don't know, it just happened. But when you talk to the leaders that have been here for a long time, they'll tell you that it's because they chose me as the lead. And, representation matters,
Mhm.
and because I'm the first lead pastor of color, you know, people of color are coming to the church because they feel like, oh, we can go listen to him because he is of color.
Mhm.
And so we didn't realize that that was going to change the landscape of the church. And what really blew my mind was the questions you guys were asking me, and how excited you guys were. That made me come back and really dive into the multiracial that we have at our church, to really understand this beautiful thing that you guys were excited when we
Mhm.
met, and then to talk to the white people group, and to ensure that what I was hearing was correct, because not one has come to me and said, we need to protect this because our numbers are going down, our representation is going down, we're losing our church. That never once happened. They actually celebrate, this beautiful array of cultures that we have now. And it's wonderful to see that the white people group just appreciate it. And they cannot wait to plant a church that's going to be the same, as what we have now. And so that's exciting to me.
It is. I mean, like, apart from the grace of God, w- how do you understand or explain kind of the positive response? Because again, for a lot of, in fact, I just started a sermon series on Exodus, and it says, the new king came and he said the Egyptians or the Hebrews are too numerous for us, right? And they begin to oppress and enslave them. And oftentimes the response of a growing number of outsiders is to feel threatened and to lash out. And, we see that happen a lot in the United States as a country and a lot of segregation in our churches. What do you think is sort of the grace that has been on the church so far?
I think two things. Firstly, I would say that um, the people that are the foundation, the founders, and the majority of them are white. That what's God here is not the color of their skin, but is the mission. And they champion the mission. And for them, I think the way that they hold firm to the mission, and they're not worried about all these particulars that come around with the different cultures coming into the church. It's truly a testament to their walk with the Lord. Because they would tell you, they hold on to revelation and talking about how heaven's going to have all these beautiful diversity of cultures. That's what they preach.
Mhm.
When I come in, that's what they push. They talk about all these different cultures, and that's what they love. And I think it starts with them. And then, secondly, I think because of the feedback that's come to me, that because I'm comfortable in my skin as a Samoan,
Mhm.
that I don't change my speech. I'm comfortable in wearing my cultural wear. Sometimes I wear my skirt, that's a cultural wear,
Mhm.
for Samoans. And because I'm comfortable in my skin, it makes them comfortable to be in theirs. And I think when people feel comfortable to be who they are, to be seen, then they're not threatened. It's
Mhm.
more of a celebration,
Yeah.
because now they can be who they are without being feeling this sense of caution, but a sense of celebration, and that's what happens. And for us, when I saw that, we quickly organized an annual international luncheon, which is a day of celebration where we tell everyone to come in their cultural wear. And so everyone comes to church with it. And then we have a luncheon at the end. And so there's like 700 to 800 people. And then everyone's got their table from their country and their food. And it's such a big feast. Everyone's going around trying all the different foods. And I think we had like 32 countries represented that day,
Uh-huh.
and the atmosphere was just, it was heaven, man.
Mm.
You know, we had different people groups singing in their native tongue, and people celebrating that as well. And it was just a real celebration of culture. But what was key to that event was everyone calling that day heaven. You know, that
Mm.
this is heaven. This is what heaven's meant to be. And I think because of that thing, because of that culture that's been embedded, it's we're not looking at other cultures and feeling threatened by them. We actually celebrate when they come
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. I think that sounds like, the heart of God. So it's it's amazing and encouraging to hear kind of that
Mhm.
story. Um, I also noticed on your website that many or most of your staff are people of color as well. And so kind of talk about that, like the change, how that played itself out in terms of um, leaders, staff, um, who's on the platform in worship, decision-making processes. Um, because I think I think maybe we even talked at Expo that there are many churches in the US that have visual diversity, but when it tries to, take place in terms of power and decisions, then it becomes more of a clash. So like Philippians 2, Jesus, he he didn't take power for himself. He laid it down.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of leaders really struggle with that. And so, share about that journey.
Yeah. So the staffing was set up from the leadership before I got there.
Mm.
You know, the way that they hired, and so you can see that our worship director is Filipino, and you've got Allison there, who's from the US. You have Pastor Abraham, who's discipleship and evangelism. He's Mexican. You know, and Gret, who's Canadian, and then I come in as Samoan from Australia. And so that team was set up by the church leaders before I arrived. And on the platform, you'll see what's represented in our congregation because Jolly and we meet every Monday, you know, to talk through service, prepare for service. And one of the things that we're really intentional about is the diversity on the platform, you know,
Mhm.
not just in culture, but in age. You know, we want to make sure that we have that diversity. And so she's done a great job in finding songs where she can sing in multiple different languages. And when she does those songs, oh my goodness, there is not a dry eye in the church. You
Mm.
know, even though your culture is not being sang in that song, you cannot help but cry because you're hearing a song that you're so used to in English being sung in Spanish or Russian or Portuguese, you know, or Filipino, you know,
Mhm.
Tagalog. Like it's amazing to hear it, you know. And so she does a great job in bringing that diversity because we want to make sure that what's on the platform is representative of the congregation, you know, and so we're very intentional about that. And also when it comes to leading, you know, multiracial community, it's listening. You know, that's the key thing. And because I'm a Samoan, you know, in my culture, you're taught to listen. So I go to these different people groups when they have their side gatherings. I attend them.
Mm.
You know, I sit with them and I do their celebrations with them. And because they see me, they see that I'm present. You know, I'm not just this head on the platform, but I'm with them in community, understanding what they're doing, spending time listening to them. And if there's something I learned that we can implement in our leadership or church or on the platform, we implement it, you know, because it's going to help them be seen and felt like they're a part of the community as opposed to just an add on, you
Mhm.
know. And so listening to people is critical, that I found in trying to lead a multiracial church and keep the unity, you know, of spirit and mission within it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Amazing. Now, tell me about the church planting piece. Where did that impetus come from for you guys to plant? And You had shared before that there was very much the desire that it be a multicultural, multiracial church that is planted. But was that already there before you came? Kind of, how did that come about?
Yeah, well, the multiracial landscape change, as I shared earlier,
Yeah.
only in the last few years, right? That it's dramatically changed. We always had multi-ethnicity here, but not to the degree that we have now to the main, people group,
Hmm.
that being white. And so to have the church the way that it is, and parallel to our conversations with leadership about church planting, well, it was made very clear that when we plant churches, we want it to look like, multiracial church planting. We don't want to just go in and reach one people group. We want to make sure we reach everybody that we can. And so our leaders, what we found, like our leaders to the Russian speaking group, they they're constantly having to remind the people that what I'm a part of is bigger than the part I play. We're a part of this multiracial church. That's the most important thing is the mission of God as this church, not the part that we play as Russian speaking people. And that's the same for the Spanish and so forth. And so having those key leaders in those different people groups is absolutely critical because when someone comes in, like we just had two different families looking for asylum in Canada, one from Mexico, one from Colombia. And then when they were brought to our church, we took them to the Spanish speaking group. So they found community instantly, right? Because they can speak the language. But very quickly, they were discipled to understand that you're not here just to be in the Spanish group. You're here to be a part of the the bigger group. And so, because of that, that's why leadership has a great desire to plant churches that's going to be multiracial, exactly what we're experiencing now. Because in their own words, it's the closest thing to heaven,
Mm.
to see all these cultures coming to church, walking to church, and for them to look at the landscape and all the different shades of colors of people's skin, they love it, and they don't want to see anything but that, in our church planning. And so we have to be careful in who we send. And so the people we send, we want them to understand that. That's part of the process. And so when they choose their team, we want to make sure that their team has that diversity. We're not going to force it upon them, but they already understand it, that the type of church that we want is a church that can reach all races. And we have that in Canada simply because of the immigration here in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Um, Maybe this might be the last question. What advice would you give to those who are planting or pastoring multiracial churches?
Um, I think I said it before, listening.
Mm.
Like you got to listen to these different people groups in the church. That to me, I think that's the biggest. And and then second to that, and equally important is raising key leaders within those people groups. Because people, whether we like it or not, when people come in, if they're Russian speaking, the Russian speaking leaders is going to be able to build community very quickly and make them feel safe, make them, feel that this can be their home, at this church. But what's more importantly is that those leaders will quickly disciple them to be a part of the church, right? That this is all of us, what I'm a part of is bigger than, who they are. And so, but that happens through a leader that can speak their own tongue. And those two things, listening and having key leaders in those people groups, has really helped us maintain that unity. And not only that, a byproduct of that we didn't plan on was the discipleship happened so quickly now. So those two families that have come into the church, we have dedicated their kids, they're in Bible studies, and they're set for baptism. And so a lot of them are able to assimilate into our community effectively by having key leaders in those people groups and being able to bring them through that discipleship track to be a part of the whole community and not
Mm.
be separatists. Because that's the worst thing that we see is a challenge that a people group can grow in our church and then feel like they have to be separatists. And that's what we're very careful. We don't want that. And so listening to them and then having key leaders in those people groups is what we found to be
Mhm.
important for us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Um, yeah, such a great story, and to hear it is neat to hear your own formation story, and then how that's like you said, having struggled with anger, and then to find healing in Christ and with your mom, and then to sort of reconcile within yourself, and that's in our work, we talk a lot about kind of the inner formation that is the prerequisite to, like you said, if you're not comfortable in your own skin, if you don't believe you've been fearfully and wonderfully made, then you won't be able to lead other people to that place either. So,
Oh yeah,
yeah, so that's really beautiful.
yeah. Because if you're not comfortable in your skin, then you're going to be threatened by these different cultures,
Mhm.
and you don't want that. And
Yeah.
if you're about God's mission, then the shepherd's heart is for everybody.
Hmm.
No matter who they are, their background or walk, and my mom has a huge part to play in that. She's been for all her flaws, she's been the biggest disciple and encourager in my life, and still to this day, she's still discipling me, and she's a big, she prays a lot. That's a big thing.
Hmm.
She's big on faith and prayer. So
Yeah.
it's definitely prepared me for this calling, even though my life as a young person wasn't leading to this calling, but
Uh-huh.
my mom definitely always saw it. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, you shared about being more shy and introverted, but I'm so glad that you have this story, and I just think it's going to be God's going to continue to use this story and a humble heart, to listen means that you have to want to change and grow, and so I just commend God's work in your life, and you know hope that there'll just be an abundance of opportunities to tell your story and share your story. Not just you, but like the church really, those leaders really prepared the way for you to flourish and thrive and um, disciple many people groups. So yeah.
yeah, I'm really blessed. Like I keep telling my friends back in Australia, like the founders of this church, there needs to be a book written on them because, the church that I get to serve at, and I'm not even exaggerating this, Len, there is no in-house fighting. I've
Mm,
never been to a church with
mm,
no in-house fighting. Like it is a breath of fresh air leading this church, and it's the founders. The vision that they put together. They're focused on the vision. They're so focused on community outreach. They don't
mhm,
have time to fight with each other.
mhm,
You
mhm,
know, so all these different races that are cultures that are coming into this beautiful culture of empowerment, of discipleship, of service, and so I give a lot of credit to the founding members of this church because what they've created here, I'm still trying to figure it out because I want to share it with others because it is truly a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, this has been a gift, just to connect more, and I hope we'll stay connected and in this journey. And I can imagine, you know, y you guys taking on interns and helping people, plant, church planting residencies and all kinds of things going forward. So,
I'm hoping for that. I'm so excited for this next step. I've been going to Exponential for 8 years now, and
uh,
I'm just waiting for the Lord to tell me this is the time.
uh,
And I thought it was going to happen in Australia, and now I'm in Canada, and it's happening now. So,
yeah.
the Lord's timing is always correct. So I'm just excited to be able to plant and to keep planting, and like you said, to be a center that trains and equips and sends.
Hmm.
That's what I'm excited about.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, good. Yeah. Thanks for your time. It's getting into the evening here, and yeah, really grateful. And I'll send you when take the different pieces and put together, I'll send it back to you. So
No worries. Appreciate it.
yeah. Well, blessings. And this is great.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for being patient with me, and till next time.
All right. Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.